Now, as we enter into this holiday season, most of us will probably join together around tables with family and friends, and as we do, it's pretty likely that you'll start to reminisce and tell stories of times past. Family gatherings are often the place where tales and legends are passed down from one generation to the next. And even if you've heard the same stories over and over again, it's still pretty great because those stories are what shaped your family. Stories of adventures taken, stories of when you got into a ton of trouble, stories of hilarious things that happened in the past, stories that really summarize who someone is. All those stories, the good and the bad, when you look back on them, they make up your family history. They shaped who you are. Looking back together helps your family to look forward. Hindsight is often 20/20, and when we reflect on the stories of our collective past, even though they aren't perfect, they are valuable. Our stories passed down from generation to generation are a heritage for us. And that's precisely what we've been growing to see throughout this series that we've been doing for several weeks now called God of Our Fathers. Through the ups and downs, the good and the bad, the successes and the failures in these ancient stories, we have been establishing a lot about our faith heritage, what makes us who we are, what makes us believe what we believe. Perhaps you can even imagine, as we've read these stories throughout the book, you could imagine Abraham sharing these stories around the fire to his son Isaac. And then Isaac passing down those stories to his son Jacob. And then Jacob eventually passing down these stories even of his own life, the things that are funny, the things that are good, the things that were not so good, telling those stories to his 12 children. And then generation after generation after that, eventually down to Moses, who compiled these stories into a book. These stories of this sort of family faith heritage are passed down to us, and it is beneficial for us to see these things. Because as we've seen very clearly, these are not stories of heroes making all the right choices. Instead, they are much more like stories of people stumbling around, falling into the favor and the goodness of God. As a whole, all these messy stories have shown us the great patience and loving kindness of the Lord for his people. And as we'll see today, as we continue through the story of Jacob's journey home, we'll see that story kind of continue. And as we go through, especially as we approach Thanksgiving, I think we would do well to reflect on these kinds of stories and make us think about our own faith journeys, looking back and seeing not just fun stories, but also how God has patiently guided and cared for us as we go along our way. So let's look together at Genesis chapter 31. Remember, last week we saw in Genesis 30 how Jacob fulfilled his time working for Laban, his father-in-law, and how he was ready to return to the land that God promised him. Now, despite Laban trying to ruin his plans by taking all the sheep and goats that he had promised to give him, God still prospered Jacob and allowed him to be ready to move with his family and his people and his servants and all of his livestock back to the land of Canaan from whence he came, back to the land of his father. And this is how the story continues in Genesis chapter 31, verses 1 through 3. It says, "Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, 'Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's, he has gained all his wealth.' And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, 'Return to the land of your forefathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you.' After working the 14 years to which Jacob agreed to work for Laban so that he could marry initially Rachel, but then Leah and Rachel, it still took time after that for Jacob to depart. The passage that we read last week about the breeding of the sheep and the goats and getting enough striped and spotted one, that took about 6 years for all of that to take place. So Jacob has well overstayed his agreed upon time. And during that time, that extra 6 years, clearly the relational tension between Jacob and the rest of Laban's family has grown. You'll remember last week that Laban said to Jacob, "Surely God has blessed me because of you." He saw that God had worked in Jacob's life and he had benefited from those things. But in this extra time that passed, especially after Laban decided to deceive Jacob with the sheep and the goats, things have soured. Now, as Jacob said in the passage that we just read, Laban looks on him not with the same favor that he did before. And especially Laban's sons, who live far to the north, are really jealous of Jacob and all that he has gained. Now, instead of seeing that God has blessed Laban because of Jacob, the sons say, Laban has blessed Jacob. And they don't like that very much at all. And in the midst of this tension, God speaks to Jacob. You may have noticed in the past couple of chapters that we've read that God has seemed in a way to be somewhat distant, that we haven't heard direct words from God. And as far as we know, Jacob had not received any direct revelation from God since he had that dream about the ladder way before he ever even arrived at Paddan Aram. Before he even got to meet Rachel, God had spoken to him then, and we don't know that God had spoken to him in between over that course of 20 years. But way back in Genesis chapter 28, we were told that God said this to Jacob in verse 15. God said, "Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you." Surely, over this time, even though we haven't heard much from God, God has proven this to be true. We've seen evidence of God's presence with Jacob, even in the intense family drama that he has endured. But all of this has taken place over some 20 years, and after all this time, God speaks to Jacob again and reassures him, saying, "Not only have I been with you, but I will continue to be with you as you go back to your homeland." Now, my hope is when you look back on your own life, on your own journey, when you reflect and tell your stories to generations that come after you, I hope that you can confidently say, God has been with me. So the first blank I want you to fill in this morning as we think about this passage is looking back, we should be able to see how God has been present with us. Whether your faith journey is new or if you have known the Lord for decades, my hope is that you can look back and see how God has been with you. Now, things may not have been perfect. They certainly weren't perfect for Jacob. We have seen that very clearly. You may not have heard God speak to you in the same way that Jacob did at all. But Jacob still barely heard from God over the course of 20 years. And still, there's been this persistent, undeniable presence of God with him. And I hope that's true for you too. With just a little bit of introspection, looking back on your life with a mind that is being sanctified by Christ, you ought to be able to see all sorts of signs that God has been present with you. And those signs that God has been present with you, those stories that you have, should be shared from generation to generation. It should be something that we talk about around the table together, that we have a God who has proven himself to be present with us. The story goes on, and Jacob actually does describe God's presence with him in more detail. This is Jacob taking that chance to tell this story now to his wives about how God has done this, how God has been with him. Look at Genesis 31, verses 4 to 13. It says, "So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was and said to them, 'I see that your father does not regard me with favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes, and I saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. And I said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land, and return to the land of your kinsmen. Jacob brings Rachel and Leah out into the field to get them on board with this major life decision. Obviously, leaving their relatives and their homeland, the only home that they had ever known, is going to be really hard for them. This is a major shift in their lives, and Jacob wants them to be comfortable with this transition. And while Jacob's faith has still not entirely matured, he cannot deny God's presence in his life. So he reassures his wives, telling them in detail how God has been with them. Out in the field, Jacob says, you can imagine them standing out in that field amongst all these livestock. He says, look at the way that God has blessed us. I've served faithfully, and God has been faithful to us. Look at all that we have. God has made us ready to go. Look at precisely how God has done this. And Jacob explains how he worked tirelessly for their father Laban, and yet Laban continued to cheat him. In addition to the deception of Laban that we read about last week, here we read that Laban also changed Jacob's wages 10 times. Now, I think we can rightly imagine that that wasn't Laban giving Jacob a raise 10 times. Nobody complains about getting a raise, right? No, this was Jacob decreasing or changing the way that Jacob would be paid. So, of course, he's upset about this. And as we read last week, Laban agreed that Jacob could take the striped, spotted, and colored sheep and goats, only for Laban then to remove all those from the flock so that they were less likely to have them. But even so, as Jacob explains, God made a way for him. Look in verses 10 to 13. Jacob explains that God spoke to him in a dream during that time. And in that dream, God showed Jacob striped, spotted, and mottled sheep and goats. The kinds of goats and sheep that Laban had taken away. Those sheep and goats were not in the flock anymore. Yet in this vision, Jacob sees clearly striped and spotted sheep and goats mating and producing more. This is God showing Jacob in the vision what he is going to do for him. He's proving the outcome. He's saying to Jacob, you may see only solid colored sheep and goats in your flock, but I don't see them that way. I see them as striped and spotted, and they will indeed produce striped and spotted. And as we talked about last week, God is the author of their DNA. He's the one who weaves them together, who places every hair on them. And so Jacob had all of them. And with confidence, Jacob explains, God spoke to him. God has done this. And he's telling Leah and Rachel that it's time to go. Jacob is able to look back and see how God has intentionally guided and acted in his life. So for our own reflection this morning, we could say this, the next blank on your sheet is that looking back, we should be able to see how God has worked for us. Circumstances and experiences will vary. I know that things don't work out perfectly for you. Clearly, when we look at this messy story of Jacob and his whole family, it didn't always work out perfectly for them either. And yet, God was working. Sometimes even in spite of their mistakes, God was clearly doing something. And with the smallest degree of Christian maturity, we ought to be able to look back on our lives and see how God has worked through our circumstances, how he has put us on a certain path, how he has protected us from the wrong path, how he has placed certain people around us and provided for us and taking us where we never thought we might be. At the very least, even if you're young in your faith, you should be able to look back on your life and see how much worse it could have been. Knowing your own heart, knowing your own tendencies, you should be able to think back on your memories and the choices that you have made and say, I'm pretty sure God prevented my life from being way worse than it could have been. How God has protected me from myself. We ought to be able to confidently say, if it weren't for God, I would have messed my whole life up far, far more. If it weren't up to God, then my life would be a disaster. If it were only up to me, I would be far worse off. We can know that for sure. God has worked in our lives. He is present with us, and he has worked in our past. Now, back in Genesis chapter 31, look at verses 14 to 16. As Jacob explains all this, Rachel and Leah cannot help but agree. It says, then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do." So there's no love lost here between Rachel and Leah and their father Laban. He did basically sell them. And now Laban wants to trap them there and withhold what their husband has earned. And that's not going to fly with these two ladies. These women have had enough. They are ready to go. It continues on like this in verses 17 to 21. It says, "So Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels. He drove away all his livestock, all his property that he had gained, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. And Jacob tricked Laban, the Aramean, by not telling him that he intended to flee. He fled with all that he had and arose and crossed the Euphrates and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead." Having agreed to leave together, they make this hasty escape. They intend to leave in secret. While Laban is gone to shear his sheep, they bolt. They don't want to make this departure official or even say goodbye. They pack up and go. And as we talked about last week, Laban sent his sheep and goats up to his sons 3 days north of him. So he's relatively far away. That gives them this buffer of time to pack up all their stuff and leave. And there in verse 19, we are casually told that while they're packing up and leaving, Rachel wanders into her father's tent and takes his gods. Now that's a strange decision for Rachel to make. She's stealing these small statues, these figurines, these idols. Now this shows us a couple of things. First of all, it shows us that Laban, while he recognized that he was blessed by the God of Jacob, did not adopt the God of Jacob as his own. He still practiced the pagan practices and superstitions of the people around him. He kept in his house idolatrous gods, false gods, worshiping them and looking to them for guidance as well. And still, Rachel's decision here is a little bit strange, isn't it? What does she care about these things? Now, we don't really know why she decided to do this, but there could be a couple of explanations. She may have snuck in and done this just to spite her father, saying, "Dad, I know you like these things. We're so mad, we're going to steal your favorite things and get out of here." Or it could have been that these false gods, these idols, were covered in precious metals or jewels. They may have been valuable, and she's like, well, let's get out with a little extra. Let's take these things to make us even more wealthy. Or some scholars even theorize that it was possible that if you possessed the gods of a household, that you could come back later and then claim all of the property to be yours. We don't really have any evidence that that was the case in this particular story, but it's certainly possible that they would bargain with these things later on. Now, what we do know, however, is that there is a significant comparison being drawn to us here. The scriptures show us this detail about Rachel stealing the gods for a reason. Jacob's God has spoken and acted very clearly. Jacob's God, the one true God, has prospered him and given him wealth. Jacob's God made colored and striped sheep and goats be born so that they have what they needed. Jacob's God is real. Laban's gods, on the other hand, well, they couldn't even defend themselves when a girl came into the tent to take them. Laban's gods were nothing. They were pointless statues, easily snatched away against the will of their owner. The idols are nothing. Those idols are not real. Now, keep in mind, Jacob does not know that Rachel did this. So they leave with Rachel's secret bag of idols, and this is how it goes on in verses 22 to 24. It says, "When it was told to Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsmen with him and pursued him for 7 days and followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban, the Aramean, in a dream by night and said to him, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" Remember, like I said, Laban was 3 days away. So when they depart, even though they are traveling with this huge herd and lots of people and lots of stuff and moving slowly, it still takes time for Laban not only to hear about the fact that they left, but to catch up. So over about 7 days, he does begin to catch up with him. But in that time, God appears and speaks to Laban in a dream. He says to Laban, "Lay off your boy Jacob. Don't go near him. Don't say anything to him, anything good or bad. Leave my chosen one alone or else. Don't threaten him. Don't try to convince him to stay. He's with me. But too bad Laban is not a good listener. Look at Genesis chapter 31, verses 25 to 32. It says, and Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what have you done that you have tricked me and driven away all my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and trick me and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre? And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And now you've gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods? And Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters away from me by force. Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours, and take it. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So like I said, Laban, traveling much lighter than Jacob is able to overtake him in the hill country. And as Laban confronts Jacob, the conversation is really interesting. Laban acts as if he doesn't understand the tension here. He tries to play the nice guy, saying, look, if you just told me that you wanted to go, I would have thrown you a party. We would have had music. We could have had a feast. I would have sent you off with joy. But we know that's a lie. It's nonsense. Then Laban basically says, God warned me not to say this, but it is in my power to do you harm. Now, far be it from me to go against the word of the God of your father, but I could hurt you right now if I wanted to. Now, Laban also asks Jacob, why'd you steal the gods? And Jacob has no idea that that even happened. So when Jacob replies to Laban, he actually puts a death sentence on to Rachel without knowing it. He doesn't know that the gods were stolen. So he says to Laban, if you find your stolen stuff anywhere in all my stuff, you can take whoever stole it and you can kill them. That's some tense stuff, right? Let's continue on to see what happens in verses 33 to 35. It says, so Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the two female servants, but he did not find them. And he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. Laban felt all about the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me. So he searched, but did not find the household gods. Now, does this not read like a scene out of a movie? We all know that the gods are hidden. They're there in the camel saddle. And you can imagine how tense and like her heart pounding as Laban was searching her whole tent looking for these things. And she's sitting right on top of them. They're right there. We all know that they're there. She knows that they're there. Laban doesn't know that they're there. And it's an amazing scene that plays out as Rachel says, Lord, forgive me, I cannot stand up because the way of women is upon me. It's her time of the month, so she can't stand up off the camel's saddle. Now, women, I think you all know that this is a pretty foolproof way to get men to leave you alone, right? If you want to get out of something, to get out of some trouble, you simply have to say, I can't. I'm having lady problems. And men in your life will typically just say no more. I don't know about it. I don't want to hear about it. I don't understand how any of that works. Just leave me out of it. You do you. So next time, ladies, you're sitting on the couch and your husband says something to you like, will you come outside and help me shovel the driveway? All you have to say is what Rachel said there. Let not my Lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me. And he'll let it go, probably, right? Now, in addition to this being an interesting scene, this could also be told to us again as a comparison. God, the one true God, spoke not only to Jacob, but also warned Laban not to do this. And even still, those false gods who were easily stolen away are now defiled because an impure woman is sitting on top of them. That's how worthless these idols are. That's the comparison that we're being shown here. Now, all the drama about the idols and the deception aside, I think we can also be reminded this morning that looking back, we should be able to see how God has shown mercy toward us. Just as we have seen many times before, people mess up, people sin. Rachel should not have done this. She is in the wrong. Laban should not have disobeyed God and gone toward to speak to Jacob. And yet, God withholds his righteous judgment. He stays his hand. He shows mercy and refrains from punishing wrongdoing, at least for a time. Now, looking back on your own life, if you're honest about your own sin, you should be able to see pretty clearly many examples in which you have been shown mercy, times when you did not get what you deserve. How many times has God saved you from yourself or from the consequences of your sin? If you're like me, you'll recognize that you have gotten away with a lot because God has been merciful towards you. Think of those stories from your past, probably from when you were a teenager, where you'll say, I can't believe I got away with it. That's God's mercy in your life. You should not be able to get away with those things, but God shows mercy towards us. Look back at Genesis chapter 1, verses 36 to 43. It says, Then Jacob became angry and berated Laban. Jacob said to Laban, What is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? For you have felt through all my goods. What have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. What was torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was. By day the heat consumed me, and cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I've been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. So Jacob is done with Laban. He's been saving up these feelings for a while. He probably rehearsed this speech somewhat in his head beforehand. He is ready to unleash on Laban, pointing out how he worked hard and how he even bore losses for Laban's sake. Also, we should note that Jacob went above and beyond, serving much longer than the 14 years that he agreed upon. He served 6 extra years for Laban. And very clearly, Jacob gives credit to God. He says that if it weren't for God being on his side, surely Laban would have allowed Jacob and mistreated him even more, sending him away empty-handed. But now, because God reprimanded Laban and allowed Jacob to leave successfully, Jacob is even more sure of the presence of God with him. And on a quick side note, look at verse 42. Jacob lists a few titles for God. He says, the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac. You'll notice that fear is capitalized there. That's because this is presented as an official title for God. This is the only chapter in the Bible, only 2 times in this chapter, that title is used for God. He calls God the fear of Isaac. Now, what is that about? Well, on the one hand, it's about Laban's relationship with Isaac. Remember, Laban met Isaac before when he came to marry his sister, right? And he saw Isaac's great wealth and was very impressed by the man and was fearful of Isaac. But now, Jacob is saying, the fear of Isaac is my God. You fear Isaac. Isaac fears my God. Do you understand what he's saying here? But then even more than that, we should understand that this is communicating to us this repeated thing throughout the Bible, which is a reverent fear of a righteous and holy God. a God that is all powerful, a God that is able, in Jacob's case, to make the right kind of sheep and goats to be born, a God that is able to speak to them in their dreams and tell them what is good and right and what is wrong. That God is to be feared, and it is good for us to have fear of him. Now, look back at the passage once more, verses 43 to 50. It says, "Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, 'The daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day for these my daughters, or their children whom they have borne? Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me.' So Jacob took a stone, and he set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, 'Gather stones.' And they took the stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jegar-sahadutha, but Jacob called it Gilead. Laban said, 'This heap is a witness between you and me today.' Therefore he named it Gilead, and Mizpah, for he said, 'The Lord watch between you and me, and when we are out of one another's sight. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives besides my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is witness between you and me.'" So Laban still here responds with pride. He claims that all that Jacob has belongs to him. He's clearly, though, not willing to die on this hill, literally. He's fearful of the God that Jacob has professed before him. So he's not going to press any further. Instead, Laban suggests a peace treaty, and Jacob obliges. So they set up a stone monument there to mark the occasion, much like Jacob did at Bethel. Now Laban calls this place Jegar-sahadutha, which is Aramaic for the heap of witness. But Jacob calls it Gilead, which means the same thing in Hebrew. Laban bends and also agrees to call it Gilead in the Hebrew language, but he also adds the name Mizpah, which means watchtower. This is meant to be somewhat threatening between Jacob and Laban. It's Laban saying to Jacob, God's watching. If your God is so real, if you're so fearful of him, if I'm a little fearful of him now, then we should understand that God is watching. So don't mistreat my daughters. Don't take any more wives than them. Don't mistreat my grandchildren. This is the agreement that Laban is making with Jacob. And the passage wraps up like this in verses 51 to 55. It says, "Then Laban said to Jacob, 'See this heap and the pillar which I have set between you and me? The heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap and this pillar to me to do harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us.' So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and Jacob offered a sacrifice in the hill country and called his kinsmen to eat bread. They ate bread. They spent the night in the hill country. Early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned home." This place that they have marked will stand as a reminder of their sworn agreement to do no harm to one another. They parted ways, not because of their great diplomacy, but because God had intervened. So Laban kisses his grandchildren and leaves. And we will not hear anything about Laban at all again. So here we're finally reminded of this. The last blank on your sheet is that looking back, we should be able to see how God has defended us. Like Jacob, we should be able to think back on real, tangible times in which we were defended or rescued or upheld by our God. We cannot take all the credit for where we are. I know I would not be where I am today if it weren't for the good hand of God defending me, guiding me, and acting on my behalf. We should be able to look back and clearly thank God for what he has done to get us through this sin-broken world. So as we close for today, appropriately on this Thanksgiving week, I hope that you can be a little bit introspective. My hope is that you're able to look back on your life and see how God has acted in all of these ways for you, and particularly how he led you to believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, changing your life forever. And I hope that you're able to tell those stories I hope that you're confident enough to pass those stories down, share them around the table, and give God the glory for how he has been your God, the God of your fathers. Tell those stories. Bear witness. Tell them again and again. Let the real stories of your real God acting in your life stand as a monument for future generations. Let's pray as we close for today. God, we can't thank you enough for all the work that you have done in our lives. You are indeed the fount of every blessing in our lives, the source of all that is good. Every good and perfect gift comes from you. So for that reason, God, we thank you for all of your goodness to us, for your mercy shown to us. Help us to raise our hearts and our minds to you and share these stories, passing our faith down from generation to generation. For we serve a good God who has cared for us well, who has acted on our behalf. Thank you most of all for your Son, Jesus Christ, who rescues us and saves us from our sin. Thank you for sending him to die. And thank you especially for working among us, for working in our hearts and lives, and for giving us this church to grow with together. In your name we pray, amen.